What's up, y'all? I'm Josh from Louisiana, and I want to thank you for tuning in to my final recap of Feud, Capote vs. the Swans. We've made it to the season finale, which felt more like a fever dream of Truman's rather than reality, though it was interesting to see how his thought process might play out during his writing. And playing to the title of Phantasm Forgiveness, you can see that his final push to the end of his book, Answer Prayers, seemed more about his hopeful end with all of his swans and how, when all was said and done, he dreamt that they absolved him of all his wrongful actions. Now, one last time, as a reminder to everyone, this is a recap in which I will be going through all of the key events of the episode. So if you haven't watched yet, be aware that there are spoilers ahead. Hope y'all enjoy. Now let's dive in. So we start in 1984, the year of Truman's death, and he's visiting Babe's grave. Appalled by the carnations left by a visitor, he throws them off and begins talking to Babe as though she's right there with him, telling her about how he's been 3 months sober and even the thought of a drink makes him squirm. But Truman knows that he's not long for this world and tells Babe that he might be joining her very soon. Then we've got Truman arriving unannounced at Jack's apartment, begging to come inside. However, Jack has his new beau cooking dinner and doesn't want to subject him to Truman. But his man comes to the door and invites Truman inside. After dinner, Truman and Jack begin throwing light jabs at one another. Jack says he's getting along without Truman very well, but you can tell that even though Jack says he's done with Truman, there's still some level of love there for him. Truman goes on to say that he's nearly finished with Answered Prayers and that it will be an apology to his swans for Lacote Basque and a confession of all his transgressions. Trying to manage Truman's expectations, Jack says it's too late for Babe, Bill definitely won't forgive him, and what if the ladies tell him to fuck off? But Truman says that people both want to forgive and be forgiven. And Truman wants forgiveness not only for what he wrote, but also for the things he's done, which one can assume is all of the vicious and salacious gossip he's spread about nearly everyone he's ever met. Cut to Truman writing Answered Prayers. He has visions of the Last Supper at Lacote Basque and sees all of his main points of subject matter. There's Babe and Bill, Slim, CZ, Ann, and Lee with her sister Jackie. But what was interesting to me is that everyone was renamed in his telling of the story except for Lee and Jackie. We see Lee order a drink that her sister copies, and Truman goes on to say, poor Jackie can't help herself but to steal even her sister's drink order. And this just got me thinking, is this some sort of Easter egg of a feud to come? Perhaps we will get a Lee versus Jackie, and I'll get more Callista Flockhart. Truman would go on to play in his imagination with each of his swans, and first up is CZ. And CZ is basically scolding Truman for his using the swans' lives for his personal gain and splattering their privacy all over his pages for the world to see. To atone for his recklessness, he takes CZ out west to rid herself of her own past she was holding on to, and they sell her portrait to a bar for 2 whiskey shots. We're then back at Truman's apartment in New York where he sits over his typewriter, willing the words to come forth, and we hear ice clinking into the glass. And who should appear but the Supreme herself. I'm, of course, talking about Jessica Lange as Truman's mother. And she is ruthless, telling him that what he's currently writing sounds like the type of shit that he used to pound out before he found his voice. She coaxes him with a drink, and then words begin to flow. And she tells him, if it weren't for me reminding you, would you ever strive to do better? And what I wasn't sure was just his imagination or an actual event, Truman starts following Slim, or Lady Ina Coolbirth, as she was known in his stories, and he approaches her on the street. This devolves into an explosive confrontation as the venom of Truman's expose begins to seep out of Slim. But things eventually would cool down and Slim would bring Truman back to her house. Apparently, Slim was preparing to move to Santa Barbara into a 1-bedroom cottage because what he wrote about her had apparently made her a pariah in her own right. She tells him, you gained nothing, but you made me a joke. You made my dreams ugly, and that's all I had. After Truman convinces her to destroy all of her china by hurling it at the wall, he then tells her that he will be throwing another black and white ball in her honor. Here, Slim would meet her final husband, and perhaps we can assume she lives happily ever after. Then we get the one and only flashback of the entire season to Truman's childhood. And he's in hysterics, banging on a door trying to get to his mother, but she is entertaining a gentleman caller. Sending her man to get her a fresh pack of smokes, Truman's seething mother scolds him. Sad little Truman tells her that he just wants to dance with her and does a few little effeminate twirls, to which she responds, "Don't you ever worry about what people think?" Speaking, of course, about his girlish disposition. She continues to berate him, talking about the way he flounces, and says that she tells people he's her nephew because she's trying to find a man with money to marry, and she feels that he will be a detriment to that task. But she tells him that if he's as quiet as a mouse, she'll save the last dance of the night for him. And Truman would remain in that room, applying his mother's lipstick, brushing the tassels of the curtain like a little hairdresser, and lying on the floor and wait for her. And though it was a brief glimpse into Truman's past, it certainly was impactful because we see that from the earliest of ages, he was made to feel like he wasn't good enough. Then we're back to writing. After pouring another drink and taking a handful of pills, Truman begins showcasing Lee. P.B. Jones, or Truman, walks into Capote to see Lee there with her famously gay minor movie maker husband with an acid tongue, Bert Moss. As Bert leaves the table to go flirt with a chorus boy, PB hands Lee a memoir he wrote for her, written in her voice for her to share as her own, saying she would finally be better at something than her sister, because he was the one who wrote the memoir. He then tells her that he can help her get rid of her gay husband. They would end up lacing his cigarettes with sleeping medication, and then Lee would inject her husband with poison. What? This part just didn't make sense to me, but maybe it was just a liberty taken for the storyline. I mean, why just end Lee's storyline like that, though? Back to another vision of Mother Capote, she tells him that his book isn't working because it's about him receiving forgiveness from his swans, and tells him that instead he should write about her suicide. The story of the Black Swan. Truman is then joined by Ann Woodward in a vision he has of the night his mother died. Though recorded as an accidental overdose, Truman's mother was distraught because this was the night her husband left her. Truman and Ann watch on as his mother begins to spiral, and Ann tells Truman she's getting ready, I can smell it, because she knows what it's like to reach that last moment in your life when you can no longer go on and decide to go out on your own terms. Truman asks if she had ever forgiven him for what he wrote about her, and she responds with, "Never. There are some things that are beyond forgiveness, and no one else will forgive you either. Even if you write answered prayers as an apology, it will only make it worse." Truman and Ann are then at the pond outside Babe's Long Island home. Truman pulls a carefully tucked manuscript of answered prayers out of his trunk, and they sit in silence for a moment. That is until Truman pulls lighter fluid out of his pocket and pours it onto the book. He says, "I can't, it's my masterpiece." To which Ann responds, "The book or your soul? Light it. Go on." And we have this somewhat poetic end as we see answered prayers burn before Truman's eyes. Back to Joanne's house after Truman has passed, she's talking to Jack and they discuss arrangements for Truman's services. Jack tells Joanne that she should be the one to handle it all since she was the closest to him in the end. But before they say their goodbyes, Jack asks about answered prayers. Joanne tells him that his notepads were just gibberish. Not even a word made sense. And this honestly is just really sad to me because I'm sure that an incredible story actually lived in Truman's mind, but it was never able to actually make it to paper because of the drugs and alcohol that diverted his course. In our final scene of the season, we have a major flash forward to 2016 at an auction house in Los Angeles where Joanne's most prized possessions are being sold and Truman's ashes are on the block. Allegedly, Joanne kept Truman's ashes on her nightstand. And this really it made me sad because we see how much Truman really meant to Joanne and how much she loved him, and she wasn't even his favorite swan. But starting at $2,000 for Truman's ashes, it takes some time for the bids to start coming in. Then things pick up. Truman's ashes would end up selling for $45,000 as the spirits of his swans watched on. Appalled at the state of his now graceless world, they leave. Babe takes one last look at Truman's ashes, and the season ends. Watching this show really left me wishing we could return to a time where manners were paramount and glamour was just part of everyday life. But this final episode really left me with more questions than anything. First, if the finished product of Answered Prayers was never found, even though Truman told everyone he had completed it, Were there any pieces that were discovered to help aid in the telling of his story? And why were Babe, Slim, CZ, and Lee the main focus of the Swans when they weren't his only ones? He also had Gloria Guinness, Pamela Harriman, and Morella Agnelli. Honestly, I would have liked to see a few more episodes. I think that each Swan deserved her own episode to really dive deep into their lives and not just as it pertained to Truman. And though the show was Capote versus the Swans, I felt that in large part it focused on Babe and Truman's relationship. At the end of the day, I really enjoyed the show and have really enjoyed recapping it, so I would give it a solid 9 out of 10. But the meticulous attention to detail with the visuals of this Gilded Age is an absolute 10 out of 10. But what are y'all's thoughts? Is there anything you would have wanted to see more of, or any storylines you feel should have been expanded on? And one final thought, what's a famous feud you'd want to see them recreate? Because y'all already know mine. Anyways, thank you all for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed these recaps. I'll be taking some time off to be with family and focus on some writing of my own, but I'll be back soon with new content. Take care, and I'll be seeing y'all soon.